AWARE was established almost 15 years ago after the counterattacks on New York and Washington of September 11, 2001, that killed 3,000 Americans. The founders of AWARE were citizens of Champaign-Urbana who realized that instead of going after the people who committed the 9/11 crimes, the U.S. government would use those crimes as an excuse to continue its already long-standing attempt to control the Middle East and its energy resources with military force, that is, by killing people. The U.S. doesn't need oil from the Mideast, but Mideast gas and oil are needed by America's economic competitors in Europe and Asia, and so control over them gives the U.S. a major advantage over China, Germany, and other countries. That control benefits only the American economic elite, the 1%, and not Americans in general, who've seen wealth concentrate in fewer and fewer hands at an accelerating rate throughout the Clinton, Bush, and Obama administrations. The greatest crime of the 21st century, the U.S. invasion of Iraq, which killed 1 million people, was not a response to 9/11, but to Iraq's non-existent weapons of mass destruction, which Washington knew was a lie. There's a lot of news about U.S. government war-making this week, but you won't hear much of it in the American media. We'll mention some of it tonight, beginning with Ron Zook.
Yes, a number of points which I will return to as needed if more time is required to explain what I'm talking about and provide some justification, which is not easy to do in any persuasive way in this format, I must say. The big topic, I think, is the continuing attempt to encircle Russia and China by the USA, continuing to probe at the borders and see how far we can go in this kind of game of chicken with them before they fight back in some decisive way. And it's an extremely dangerous game. I don't know whether the populace is aware of the great danger of what's going on there. We've seen a resurgence of the old line professional anti-communists warning against Russia. Russian aggression is the main line there, and Chinese aggression also, or claims to territory in the South China Sea. More mission creep going on in Iraq, increasing the military presence there, easing the terms of engagement there to involve more American military in the fight with Islamic State, dropping to some extent the pretense that they are just there as trainers and backups to the Iraqi troops. The new development this week is the bombing in Libya, and I hope we'll come back to that. What set this off now at the present time, I'm unsure, but I'm sure we will get some enlightenment from my colleagues here. Some more complaints are appearing about the administration's attempt to stretch the use of military force resolution of 12 or 13 years ago now, to cover everything that they're doing in the Middle East. And a number of people are starting to complain that this is looking more and more like what's called classically in the literature Caesarism, or sometimes Bonapartism, where the elected leader becomes, in effect, a dictator. Every president since, and including Truman, has played on this theme. It came out most nakedly in Nixon's comment that if the president does it, it's not illegal. And so we've been hearing that due process of law, for example, becomes whether the White House has looked at it and approved of it. Is there any end to this? more and more there are authoritarian regimes who are relying on this doctrine, what one German observer has called orderism, the devotion to law and order, because it seems to be breaking down otherwise. In Turkey, in Hungary, in Israel. Surprisingly enough, a piece has appeared in the New York Times about concern for the crackdown on free speech in Israel by Bibi Netanyahu. And I was a little surprised to see that there, because the New York Times is ordinarily an apologist for everything that Israel does, except in some cases apparently they go too far, and they're offending some of the people on the New York Times editorial board. Katrina vanden Heuvel in The Nation says, we need a big debate about serious issues, not a new Cold War. In their zeal to defeat Trump, Democrats are getting in the gutter with him, and as a result are the verge of becoming the Cold War party. A big deal is being made out of Donald Trump's apparent personal closeness to Vladimir Putin, and I think that's all a completely trivial matter, but it apparently has a great deal of symbolic value to a lot of people, and he's being accused of treason or something approaching that, and so on. And it's a shame, I think, that we can't really focus on more substantive issues. James Carden wrote, the media's incessant barrage of evidence-free accusations against Russia. In 1 month, its government has been accused of hacking the Democratic National Committee, orchestrating the Brexit, tacitly supporting Trump, and more. Okay, there's no actual evidence, any hard evidence against this. It's all a matter of speculation and accusation to this point. So I am not taking it seriously until we have some actual hard evidence that something like this is going on. Meanwhile, back to Turkey and the uprising there, the attempted coup of about 2 or 3 weeks ago. From the Military Times on July 28th, thousands of Turkish protesters filled the streets outside the U.S. military base at Incirlik, Turkey, on Thursday, burning American flags and demanding that the government close the base. The U.S. military maintains an arsenal of nuclear weapons at Incirlik, and it is an operational hub for the air campaign against the Islamic State group in Iraq and Syria. Iraq is only about 70 miles away from the Iraqi border from the Incirlik air base. If you want to locate that on the map, Incirlik doesn't appear on a lot of maps. There's a larger, much larger city, the largest city in central Turkey, right there. At what I think 2 weeks ago we laughingly called the armpit of Turkey, and the city that you'll find there is Adana, A-D-A-N-A, and if you want to look that up. Obama's support of Erdogan is a stark reminder of Turkey's value to the U.S. Mark Landler, New York Times, July 20th, Mr. Erdogan may now be a bitter disappointment to the president, but he's still better than any other option, and like it or not, maintains a linchpin of the campaign against the Islamic State and a host of other critical issues. So this is lesser evilism again. For Mr. Obama, as for many of his predecessors, it's a familiar accommodation, struggling to square values and interests in the chaotic landscape of the Middle East. In Egypt, for example, the United States has tolerated a repressive military government in an effort to preserve another key alliance in the region. So, again, the conflict that arises between supposed American values, freedom, democracy, and human rights, we know that routine by heart now, and American interests, which must be guarded. And then we begin to hear about, at that point, pragmatic realism. And so these supposed high and holy ideals again and again get pushed aside at the time when we need some firepower on the ground. Kerry warns Turkey that actions could have NATO consequences. Foreign Policy magazine, John Hudson, July 18th. Secretary of State John Kerry warned the Turkish government that its actions could have consequences for the NATO alliance if it goes too far with its ongoing purge of thousands of military personnel, judges, and police officers accused of involvement in the last week's failed coup attempt. I think I may have mentioned that earlier. The Middle East war is widening again with the attack on Libya. Again, I think we'll have to come back to that. And I commented before this article in Time about why the Chinese will never respect our claims to freedom of navigation and other high ideals in the South China Sea, trying to impose that on the people because the USA is not a signatory to the Freedom of Navigation Convention at the United Nations. It's always been rejected by the Senate, so we have little room to talk. From Common Dreams, in an attempt to dodge a lawsuit, the White House argues that funding of the war makes the war legal. U.S. Army captain sued President Obama over legality of the sprawling ISIS conflict. So the line there has become, and it's been used many times before, since Congress has continued to vote funding for the war, after all, we can't be allowed to or seen to lose it, that's tacit approval and no further expansion or clarification of the use of force resolution is actually needed. The president this is the authorization for the use of military force. 60 words. That the president is authorized to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons that he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred in September 11th, 2001, or harbored such organizations or persons in order to prevent any future acts of international terrorism against the United States by such nations, organizations, or persons. This comments that those 60 words gave Bush far-reaching powers to combat forces associated with al-Qaeda once his administration determined the terrorist organization was responsible for the September 11th attack. And this, of course, has been stretched, enlarged, inflated again and again since then. And apparently it's infinitely elastic. There's no limit to what they think they can do and claim they can do on the legal basis of the authorization for the use of American force. And that's really running very thin in some places, and it's so threadbare now as a justification that a number of people are starting to revolt and saying, look, this is just too much. There, I'll stop.
Thank you, Ron. You're watching Aware on the Air. We'll go to Karen Aram.
There's so much to talk about now. I don't know where to start, and I wasn't here last week, so now I have to even cover a few things I should have covered last week. Okay, let me start with China. We know the ruling from The Hague related to the UN Law of the Sea went against China, as was expected, which, by the way, I need to point out, it's basically supposed to be about arbitration. And anybody who knows anything about Asian law, most of the laws throughout Asia are about arbitration. So this doesn't even apply to China. And the U.S. involvement is also rather ironic, since, as you pointed out, Ron, they are not they did not sign on to the Law of the Sea. Okay, but here's what took place 2 weeks ago that I would have talked about last week, and that's the ASEAN meeting. ASEAN is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations that was actually set up by the U.S., I think maybe immediately after World War II. And Kerry, of course, was their what's his title, Secretary? Secretary, yeah, I can't keep up with titles, okay. Secretary of State Kerry was there.
Be Victoria Nuland
which-
in the new administration.
Probably, which is to point out that the U.S. Still feels that they have the right to control ASEAN, and they do in many ways. Now, what they wanted at the ASEAN meeting, there was a bit of discontent. They wanted it to be declared in the ruling that went against China. They wanted it to be declared in the communique, the final communique, okay? And of course, China was opposed to that. Now, this ASEAN meeting took place in Vientiane, which is the capital of Laos. Now, Cambodia, who's always been a friend of China, acted on behalf of China in refusing to allow this to go into the record. But Laos also went along with Cambodia, supporting China. So this is a positive in respect to China, is that now they have one more additional friend. And if anybody remembers the Vietnam War, Laos and the Pathet Lao, that was their military at the time, they were supported by Russia. So clearly now that Russia and China have good relations, now you have Laos, who is now working with China. So while that's a positive on behalf of preventing war, which is why I support anything that's successful in respect to negotiations between China and the U.S. or Russia and the U.S. I need to point out that as they left the ASEAN meeting, according to the Wall Street Journal, okay, they reported that the diplomats in Vientiane were discussing fundamental changes to the way in which decisions will be made in the future. So their frustration over Cambodia's veto is now leading to discussion of hitherto taboo ideas about altering ASEAN's rules to allow a break from required consensus and to enable the creation of smaller coalitions that would allow an ASEAN majority to move forward on contentious issues. Well, what this means is that it's a step, okay? It's a step that could potentially lead to a breakup of the organization of ASEAN along pro-US and pro-China lines. So that's the way we play the game. All right. Now, I want to go to Turkey. There's been a lot of talk. I mean, we know what's happening in Turkey right now. Erdogan is using the attempted coup to his advantage to purge, I mean, not just to the military or members who were involved in the coup, but anyone that may have been a critic of his, closing down schools, arresting prosecutors, judges, etc. There is talk of re-implementing the law of execution or capital punishment, but that will have to be approved by Parliament. What I think is really important, I personally believe the U.S. was involved, okay? Just because the lead up to the coup was really disturbing to Washington, because they saw Erdogan suddenly, it began with his apology to Russia for the downing of the plane, the Russian plane, but then there were so many other things taking place, and Erdogan is scheduled to have an appointment in Moscow with Putin on August 9th for discussions. So what Erdogan is presenting a move closer to Iran, to Russia, to some of his neighbors, in opposition to what Washington has imposed upon him over the past 5 years. Now, if this means that he is going to move, or Turkey will be moving back to 2010, this can be very positive, because it was at that time that he allowed Washington to get Turkey involved in the war with Syria. And what we would like to see, and it looks like Erdogan is moving towards better relations with Syria and Assad. I mean, it's not going to be that easy given that they've been bombing, but for Turkish security related to the Kurds, this is really in a progressive move for Turkey, and a progressive move for U.S. control over what is happening in that region. But it is what's really important to focus on, and I think this is the most important thing, is, like you were saying, Incirlik is the military base that has 53 U.S. nuclear weapons. It's now being controlled by 7,000 police. The police are surrounding it because the military, so many of the military have been purged and arrested that Turkey is now somewhat weakened in that respect. But 7,000 police are now guarding it. Now that could have changed over the past 2 days, I don't know. But this is as of, I think, yesterday actually. So this is very, very dangerous. And I would hope that what we're seeing is a degradation of NATO and a degradation of U.S. power and control over NATO and over many of these allies, and hopefully end some of our wars. Wow.
Treason!
Oh, I know. But I'm always in favor of peace, okay? So that's hardly treasonous. But something here I want to just mention is a rebranding. We know what rebranding is in the private sector for goods and services, and we know how the U.S. has implemented this rebranding of things. We know that Blackwater went to She something or other, or X something or other, and now they're Academia. But they may have even changed since then. What al-Nusra, who has been the so-called moderate rebels that the U.S. has been supporting with weapons, with funding, with training for some time now, and they're the moderate rebels supposedly fighting ISIS, they have now changed their name. They are now called, now I'm not saying this correctly, forgive me, but it's Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, okay? And in another couple months, so we'll see what happens. But I mean, bottom line, they're kind of changing their image, okay? And that's what we call rebranding. This is what we see happening all the time. You change the name and you change the image and hope that people will forget what previously took place. What's important in Syria is Aleppo. Aleppo is the key to control of all the other Syrian territories, and we are now very actively fighting in Syria. More people are being killed all the time. And what we know is Jeremy Bash, who is Hillary Clinton's foreign policy advisor, has made it very clear that Hillary will she will review the Syria policy, and more than likely she's already implied or made the statement in the past that she would implement no-fly zones, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What people don't understand is that no-fly zones, it's not like going out and setting up border control. It means going in and bombing infrastructure, bombing all the buildings and everything. So basically it means more war if Hillary is elected. The goal would be to seal the border and therefore control. Now, I want to now talk about Libya, since as of yesterday, right after the primaries, we started bombing strikes on Libya. And it's being said that it's to stop ISIS, okay? Well, we know that's kind of, it's Sirte. We're bombing Sirte. Now, Sirte was the home of Gaddafi, and that's where many of his supporters went and, what is the word I want to use, took up their position, or went into hiding, or went underground, whatever. So of course ISIS has been there and controlling and trying to get rid of them. So now we're bombing Sirte. We're claiming it's on the request of the government of Libya, known as the Unity Government. But what we don't recognize, or we're not admitting, is the fact that there are actually 3 governments in power. Ron, perhaps could you look at Libya and see if you can point out Sirte?
Here's Sirte,
And where's-
right in the middle.
And what's next to it? Tripoli.
Yeah, well, Tripoli
And then-
is further to the west,
Right.
and Benghazi to the east.
Right.
So it's right between the two.
Right. So we're not recognizing the other governments. It should also be noted that there are something like many different divisions, militia groups, et cetera, et cetera. And Phyllis Bennis was pointing out today on Democracy Now! That the government is making it sound like they're going in to wipe out ISIS, like maybe there's 100 ISIS fighters there or something, not recognizing that Sirte has as many as 80,000 people in the population. 80,000 people, and we're bombing them. So this nonsense about the way we propose always that, oh, we're clearing out ISIS. It's total nonsense. And I also want to point out something else. It's been claimed that, oh, this decision to go in and start airstrikes on Libya just came about recently because ISIS has grown so strong. This is not true either. First of all, we've had special forces, U.S. special forces have been in Libya, very active in Libya, along right now with the French, and I believe the Italians, and the British, okay? The goal is to carve up Libya because it is the richest oil nation in all of Africa. And Libya has been used for some time now as a conduit for the weapons transfer throughout other nations. So why we waited till after the primaries, I'm not really sure. It's possible, it's just possible. Obama was hoping that Congress would pass another authority to commit military, what do you call it, the AUMF. It's possible he was waiting for that and it didn't come through. So he just went ahead without it. Not that I think it matters because, as you say, Ron, we have expanded it so much that it's almost meaningless now. But we need to look at the fact that we are bombing a nation of a city of 80,000 people, and claiming that that's the government that requested we come in. And I actually was talking about our plans to go in and airstrike back in December from an article that talked about this was the planning. And any kind of military strike, it's not something we do overnight, okay? So The Guardian was reporting that Western powers are pressuring the newly formed Libyan Unity Government Coalition assembled last week. Now this was written in December of 2015 under the nominal leadership of the Maltese government to approve airstrikes against ISIS targets in the country, and that's according to The Guardian. And I will stop there.
Do you understand what a no-fly zone entails?
bombing.
It's not just shooting down
That's what I'm
enemy
saying.
planes.
That's what I'm saying.
It involves bombing all of their airports so they can't take
yes.
off.
That's what I was just saying. It's
Yeah.
not just going and shooting down their planes. It's going in, bombing the airports, bombing all the buildings, everything in that area, and that could also mean a city. So it's not like setting up border patrol between states. Okay, it's it's very dangerous.
And
it's
this
very
this is
serious.
what Clinton has been calling for in Syria, along with the neocons in general. And it's a particularly duplicitous move on the grounds that it says, well, we're trying to prevent fighting by establishing a no-fly zone.
Right.
No-fly zone. What they're actually doing is carrying on the war against the legitimate government of Syria.
Right.
President Assad is no prize, but he is, in fact, as legitimate a ruler as, to take an example at random, Barack Obama.
Right.
And the notion that his situation is fundamentally unstable is a result of the constant American policy to try to overthrow the legitimate government of Syria, and the Russian presence in Syria, which is so denigrated by American commentators, is at the invitation of the legitimate government of Syria. So when American Pauls like Hillary and Barack begin talking about no-fly zone, what they're actually talking about is to move forward the American attempt to overthrow the government of Syria. This has been consistent American policy. American policy is not stupid. It knows
Right.
what it's doing. What it is something
Evil.
that can't be, yeah, there's the word I was looking for.
know.
Yeah, but it's also something that can't be admitted because it is evil. because it is an attempt to continue the long-term American policy to obtain biddable governments in the Middle East, and particularly, as Karen was suggested, for the control of the oil resources of the region. Now, the Syrian civil war, and that's what it is, was constructed by the United States, running guns, by the way, through Benghazi from Libya. That's the real scandal about Benghazi, and Mrs. Clinton knows it perfectly well. It actually was pointed out on this, in passing in the congressional hearings on Benghazi. But the issue in Syria is whether or not the U.S. is going to be able to overthrow the legitimate government of Syria. And there's been a good deal of backing and filling on it, particularly because in September the Russians, at the invitation of the legitimate government of Syria, began to aid them against the terrorist forces, against al-Nusra, that is to say against al-Qaeda, who were the effective American allies. As one tries to tell the story of what the U.S. has done in the Middle East over the last really now 40 years, one has to be aware that the construction of jihadism, represented finally by al-Qaeda, was an American project. And the amazing point is that in these last days, the Obama administration has reestablished the effective alliance with al-Qaeda, call it al-Nusra in Syria, in order to pursue what are the constant goals of the U.S. in the region. Now, the idea that you have to explain to Americans that our government is sponsored the terrorists and indeed are using the terrorists for their own purposes, that's a difficult idea to get across, but is in fact the case. You're listening to Aware on the Air. We have a great deal of information on the table here that I think we'll run back over our notes and talk about for a few minutes. Ron, you want to start?
Well, this sore point of American military bases abroad keeps coming up, and we are said to have anywhere from 800 to 1,000 military installations abroad, far, far in excess of what any other nation has. And they're causing endless trouble. They are, well, for example, the demonstration against Incirlik that I mentioned earlier, and I've talked several times on here about the resistance in Okinawa to the American military there. And another one that's come up recently is the huge American base at Ramstein in Germany. I've not been hearing much protest against that, but all the usual qualifications about that apply. It covers many square miles, and it's absolutely huge. It's an essential, apparently, staging point for a lot of the stuff that goes on between the USA and the Middle East.
And particularly for the drone campaign.
Right.
It seems to be
Right.
the center
Yes.
of the drone campaign.
Yeah.
Yes.
Once again, the leading American commentator on this is Andrew Coburn, who who's an editor at Harper's and has a book called Kill Chain that talks about the rise of the high-tech assassins that Obama has used throughout his presidency. Ramstein is apparently the center of that. So,
Could I mention
Sure,
the fact that THAAD, T-H-A-D-D, I think it is, which I don't have anything in front of me on that, that's the missile bases or missiles, nuclear missiles, whatever, that the U.S. is planning on putting into South Korea on the border. And they're using as their excuse North Korea's aggression. However, the missiles, China knows they're being pointed at them. The missiles are to be pointed at China. So this is something, at least the people, a lot of the people of South Korea have been coming out and demonstrating against the placement of this missile base. Because we're just continually surrounding Russia and surrounding China with nuclear missiles and NATO in Russia. So it's becoming really, really insane. It's becoming really insane. So much so that I think I will make a quote here that I talked about the other day. This comes from Mike Head and James Cogan, and they were referring to, this was July 23rd, Vice President Biden's trip to, when he went to Australia to pressure Australia into militarizing against China. And he began to refer to Khan's insanity. Now, Khan was the model for in Dr. Strangelove, okay? And the Khan representative now is named Cordesman, or Cordesman, Cordesman, and he is working for the, I call it the CSIS, or the organization, let me see here, sorry. I wasn't planning on bringing this up. Here it is. Yeah, CSIS, it's the Washington-based Center for Strategic and International Studies. And he is pushing for all of this. And it is really, really frightening. And we are really looking. They were the best and brightest in school, Carl. You're absolutely right. But I think some of them have just gone overboard into insanity. I mean, Hillary Clinton herself. Hillary Clinton herself, I mean, you have to ask the question, you know, what is she thinking with this warmongering? I mean, Obama, I mean, all of them. Do they really think that these other nations, remember, the nations we've been bombing, the nations we've been destroying, Libya was not a nuclear-armed nation, okay? These are small nations, and they were easy. Russia is not. China will not be easy. And I can tell you right now, the Chinese, they all know, and the PLA, that's the Chinese military, they are really pushing to take a stronger position militarily against the U.S. in the South China Sea. The Chinese government, Xi Jinping, in Beijing, most of Beijing, they are using traditional Chinese character of not allowing themselves to be provoked, okay? But you have a lot of Chinese people who remember very well what happened when Japan invaded. And they know that Japan is now a U.S. proxy. We have militarized them. So the Chinese government is likely at some point to listen to their people. They do that. They have to do that, okay? Because they know what could happen if they don't. So this is a very dangerous scenario
that last point is particularly interesting, Karen. I've had the pleasure, it was that, of traveling in China this past summer, obviously, what can one learn in a brief visit and not speaking the language? But I was still moved to reflect that if you look at the states, the three governments, China, the U.S., and Russia, and in spite of their enormous differences and different historical experiences, they're in some sense in a similar position today. As Ron started the program by pointing out, the U.S. policy is based on the idea that they can somehow encircle Russia and China. And the differences between the three governments are really quite interesting. The Chinese government, for all its 20th century history, is in a position today to do exactly what you were suggesting, to pay attention to its vast population and try to figure some way that it can be modernized. It's really at the beck and call of this huge population, and one sees that in the high rises of Beijing and in the political relationship with Hong Kong. The U.S., in contrast, has a policy of belligerence against China and also Russia, of encirclement, as Ron says, that's based on seeking the goals not of the population as a whole, but of the 1%. And that contrast is quite striking if you look at the world at large. Now put Russia in that equation and look at their similar but different recent history. When the Soviet Union fell in 1991, the American government, primarily the Clinton administration, did its best to reduce China to a third world country, a supplier of raw materials controlled by American capital, the same way Latin American countries had been for generations. And for a while it worked. Throughout the 90s, the U.S. was able to produce a depression in Russia that was worse than the Great Depression of the 1930s in the United States. It actually reduced the life expectancy of Russians. The life expectancy of Russians went down in those years. What happened at the end of the 90s was the emergence of a new leadership, primarily Vladimir Putin, that reversed this policy, that rejected the American attempt to turn Russia into this sort of dependency, and reasserted Russian independence from American worldwide economic hegemony. America, the U.S. government, the 1%, the American 1%, has never forgiven Putin from that. And these mad charges we hear, Ron referred to earlier, that reminds those of us old enough to remember of Joe McCarthy and Reds Under the Bed in the 1950s, are being revived to go after Donald Trump, because Trump is not down with the program in regard to Russia. But the hatred for Putin is understandable in a way for the American 1% because he frustrated their designs for Russia. So now we have a position today where these three states, similar yet different, are balanced against one another, and the belligerent one is our state. We're the one responsible for it. Putin and the Russian leadership are desperate to bring Russia out of that vast depression of the 1990s, and President Xi of China and the ruling groups in China know that they have a Chinese tiger by the tail, and the only thing they possibly can do is swarm on and ride. Otherwise, they will be devoured by the tiger. My images are getting out of hand. My apologies. I am suggesting, though, that the dynamic that Ron started with tonight, the encirclement of Russia and China, rises from the attempt by the American government to reestablish a worldwide economic hegemony that it had at the end of the Second World War, and that is slipping away to other powers around the world. That's what's driving this, and it's very dangerous.
What do you think of the relative effectiveness of the military buildup around China and Russia versus the economic program, lowering oil prices around the world and weakening Russia in that way? It would be probably far better if there were a real economic competition and even cooperation amongst the three. Instead, the U.S. has substituted military control for the economic cooperation and tries to destroy plans such as China's long-term economic plan for development, its One Belt, One Road program. The U.S. is trying to frustrate that with, as you say, military power. At the same time, it's trying to frustrate a Russian economic revival with military power in Eastern Europe. We have these vast NATO operations, amazingly threatening, as even German foreign ministers point out. And the U.S., instead of, in fact, entering into a worldwide economic development that would involve Russia and China, is trying to stifle their economic development with military power. That's the source of this vast danger that we face today.
Yes.
My question was the relative importance of that with respect to the global oil glut and the declining price of oil.
That
I think, has a lot to do with our position relative to Russia.
Well, I think you're right about that, and that is, as you point out, changing. It's not clear, as a matter of fact, what either the source or the outcome of that was. There are some who can argue, and I think it's not out of the question, that the Obama administration's pivot to Asia and with it a faint disengagement from the Middle East grew out of the fact that there was a conclusion reached in the Obama administration that control of oil, which formerly controlled the economies of competitor nations, was becoming less and less important because of the oil glut. Even more importantly, because of the rapid fall in price of alternative energy sources, most notably solar power. Suddenly that control of oil, which was so central to the American worldwide politics, wasn't working anymore. You couldn't count on it. And this is not something that escaped the attention of American planners. In many ways, the Marshall Plan at the end of the Second World War was designed to shift Europe from a coal-based economy to an oil-based economy, because we didn't control European coal but in 1945, but we did control world oil, as we have continued to do so. So this question that you raise of how much is of American policy in terms of its economic imperialism influenced by the glut of oil, I think is an extremely important one and may have amazing long-term consequences. I think we already see them in the Obama administration's method of encirclement. The old oil weapon doesn't work so well.
I'd like to point out too that China actually has the market when it comes to solar energy. They've taken over that market. And I think nuclear as well. Even recently I saw something in reference to nuclear plans to go ahead with, somebody was canceling them with France and China, and I had predicted that China would even be taking over. France has been the #1 nuclear power, company for some time now, but and Bechtel within the U.S. and then the company I worked for. But China is now, they bought the Westinghouse updated, what we call it, AP1000, back in 2006 design. So I think they're even going to be taking that over, something I don't support. But I do want to mention the sanctions that we have placed on Russia. What it's done is it's hurt the Baltic nations, many of the Eastern European nations terribly, and while the governments have gone along with us, nonetheless, a lot of the people are very, very angry about that. The only nation that is a real threat to Russia in Eastern Europe is Poland, and that's because they have a very fascistic government, and I'm using the term fascist appropriately, I do believe this time, and they are really militarizing, and that's something to worry about, war breaking out between Poland and Russia, I think. I think that's a real fear.
I'm not quite so convinced of that for the obvious imbalance in authority or in military power, but the extent to which the U.S. Is beating the war drums and threatening, as Ron pointed out, Russian aggression at every turn certainly should be noticed here. And as you say, the East European governments, not just in the Baltics, know that this is a profit source for them.
Right,
that
right,
the Americans
exactly.
the Americans are in town and they're buying support.
Exactly.
And I think that's very true. But which brings us back around, by the way, I think, to the question of Turkey, which you both raised this evening, and I think that is a very important part of what's going on there. The real question in the Turkish coup, from the point of view of the United States, is which way will Erdogan go? Are what we're seeing as a result of these complex and obscure events in Turkey, in fact, a shifting of allegiances on the part of the effective Turkish government, which is Erdogan's. He is an elected leader, but he has also consolidated his power during his presidency. the question is, will the effective alliance between Turkey and the United States give way to an effective alliance between Russia and Turkey? And the short answer seems to be yes, and that's causing the lights to burn late in Foggy Bottom, where the State Department is, because that's the real issue. That's the
Right.
real concern from the point of view. Turkey has been the conduit to the jihadists that we support in Syria. Turkey has been a major base for the U.S. to move against Syria. And in this week we've heard Mrs. Clinton say it's really very important now to get back to the serious business of overthrowing the elected government of Syria. But now suddenly we don't seem to be able to count on the Turks anymore. There's a real danger that Erdogan and Assad will shake hands.
And as I said, Erdogan is visiting Moscow, Putin, on August 9th. Let's see what takes
Yes, exactly.
place
Yeah,
there.
in the background, still shadowy, I think, is the continuing conflict within Turkey between the military influenced by Ataturk and the Young Turks from the 1920s
Right.
and the more Islamist group
But maybe-
that Erdogan represents.
But it's questionable, I think. I think that that's being blown about. I'll tell you what one real fear is, another coup taking place in Turkey. But I think that we really have to look at the big picture, which is probably more than likely the fact that the U.S. has such strong relations with the military, who we assume are all under arrest right now. But you're absolutely right. Anything could happen at any point. But if it's, I think that it's much more related to their policies in Syria and what
think-
is happening than it is between what we call the religious conflict, which may no longer be quite as clear-cut as it once was.
I think you're right about Syria. The encirclement of Incirlik base, the popular, the mob around the American base is composed in a good number of people who are against what the U.S. is doing in Syria. Many of them Syrians, some Syrian refugees themselves, but these are people who condemn the American bombing of in Syria in order to support the jihadists. Those are the folks who are demonstrating in Incirlik. So it is difficult in many ways.
And the
You've
fear-
been watching
Yeah.
Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 31st week of 2016. Another week in which the world can see that the most extensive global terrorism is not made up of just attacks by ISIS and its sympathizers in Western capitals, terribly as they are, but by President Obama's drone assassination program, which has killed thousands and is paralleled by overwhelming police killings in the U.S., far beyond what happens in other countries. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Joseph Cash, thanks to whom also this program and others like it will be available on YouTube, and see the Facebook page for Aware for articles referred to by the panel and announcements of upcoming events. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. This is Carl Estabrook for Ron Zoke, Karen Aram, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Green, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck. Didn't mean to cut you off there, but I think
I just started.
I'm happy.